Chapter 6. Home, not just a posting. Morning came with light, not clocks. The sun pushed through thin curtains or bamboo slats, warming the room before either of us woke. When the sun rose, so did we. When darkness settled, so did our bodies. It was a simple way to live, shaped more by weather and daylight than by schedules or obligations. Some mornings began inside gated communities, where a guard waved us through as we rolled out in the truck. Other mornings began in mountain villages, where smoke from cooking fires drifted through tarp walls, and roosters announced the day long before the sky turned pale. Those mornings often meant stiff muscles from sleeping on wooden doors laid across packed dirt floors, the heat of the communal fire just enough to keep the mountain cold from settling into our bones overnight. The sounds shifted depending on where we were, but we noticed them all. We lived across a mixture of environments over those years, farmers walking goats along narrow paths on their way to grazing fields, high-pitched birds calling through the thick humidity, the constant thrum of scooters moving through city streets. Evening always brought crickets, loud with a sound I had never known growing up in the United Kingdom. That sound never became background noise to us. It reminded us daily that we were living somewhere entirely different from where we started, and exactly where we were supposed to be. Sometimes the night carried other sounds. Karaoke poured through guest house windows from speakers turned far past comfortable volume, voices competing loudly with music that drifted through the streets until long after midnight. Instead of irritation, it became part of the place. Another reminder that life outside our small routines was moving just as much as ours. For long distances and team travel, we used a sturdy four-wheel drive vehicle built for narrow mountain roads and flooded tracks. For daily errands or weaving through crowded towns, we relied on a small scooter that rattled faithfully through traffic and dust. We visited markets, villages, and city streets together, balancing schedules, supplies, and whatever the day demanded. Life became routine without ever becoming predictable. We worked together, traveled together, and rested together. The most consistent part of our days was often the simplest. Walking with Jedi in the rare spaces beyond villages or down empty stretches of open fields where the noise of work and expectation faded behind us. Those walks belonged only to us, with no schedules and no teams or translation between languages or cultures, just footsteps, the dog racing ahead, and the comfort of being side by side with no need for conversation. Jedi ran every walk as if it were the greatest moment of his life. He chased puddles, leaves, insects and shadows with equal determination, circling back often to check that we were still following him. His energy fit the pace of our life, restless, curious, and always. TJ adapted to field life without hesitation. He had spent years in America, carrying a longing to return to Asia. Where some expatriates struggled with interrupted electricity, inconsistent water, or the daily challenge of finding food, TJ treated each inconvenience like part of the adventure. We learned to live with whatever was available. Sometimes electricity cut out, so candles appeared without complaint. Other times water stopped running and buckets replaced faucets. If we craved food we grew up with, we searched small import shops for Western ingredients, carefully checking blocks of butter and separating the least fish-scented option from the rest. Sometimes we found coffee, sometimes we did not. When the craving intensified, I learned to bake bread and cook meals from scratch using locally available ingredients. Majority of other days we ate entirely native food and never thought twice about it. Both felt natural. Neither felt like a sacrifice. Southeast Asia was not temporary for us. It was not a chapter we planned to close and return to later. It was where we expected to remain, building our work, our marriage, and our future in a place that constantly shifted between comfort and unpredictability. Our SUV 4x4 rumbled steadily with Jedi sprawled across the back seat, and our truck always packed with village supplies. We sometimes headed into areas that discouraged foreigners, regions that authorities lightly controlled and watched, as these authorities preferred outsiders to stay away. Yet somehow we always passed through without incident, not because of bribes or influence, but because our presence had become accustomed, routine, and unobtrusively accepted. At checkpoints, soldiers and police glanced at our registration, then at Jedi, then back at us. A few would wave, some would ask for photos. The dog quickly became a celebrity, and sometimes we joked that his black Mastiff Lab mix features made him a local hero before either of us even stepped out of the vehicle. Small gestures mattered more than anything else. On one occasion, an official asked for a pen to complete our paperwork. I leaned out of the truck window, handing her several, saying she could keep them. The embarrassment vanished, replaced by a smile that stuck in memory. We always carried small gifts such as pens, soda, and snacks. They acted like a tiny currency of trust. Our reputation grew with every detail of compliance and courtesy. TJ roamed through these moments as if he had been doing it all his life. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that sometimes brushed his shoulders, he carried an almost instinctive calm that people noticed. Children would reach out to touch his hairy arms, stroke his beard in the winter, or simply grin up at him in awe. Men occasionally followed the gesture, curious and respectful, sensing the low-key authority he carried. In one memorable encounter, a local airport security officer paused mid-one scan, looked him up and down with obvious curiosity, and whispered to me that my husband was extremely handsome. I translated later, and we laughed. A moment that reminded us this life required both patience and levity. Language was another tool we used daily. I often spoke more to address, while TJ leaned on me to bridge gaps. Together we formed a seamless partnership as he handled the physical presence and people's wonder, and I navigated words, culture, and subtle expectations. Jedi took part in all this too, sitting for photos, wagging his tail, earning smiles and gentle scratches. Visiting villages, crossing borders, carrying supplies, meeting officials, and sharing laughs with locals, we never arrived empty-handed. Our truck or scooter always held rice, salt, oil, and dry pork shoulders, sometimes placed without announcement for those struggling through a hard season. We also brought sunglasses and school supplies because slight gestures meant everything to children and elders alike. One of our favorite sights was a grandmother in her field, bright red sunglasses perched on her nose, tending her crops with determination. It was Yimei who first called me sister. She was small, strong, and quick to laugh, the woman who carried her complete village in her heart. Her people lived high in the mountains, where clouds rolled through the valleys, and the air turned silver with mist. A deep gorge split the land in two, and only a handful of bridges connected the two sides. Where the distance was too great, zip lines filled the gaps, massive steel cables stretched across the gorge. People and sacks of grain traveled back and forth in hand-woven harnesses, the full weight of a life suspended by rope and trust. Even cows and ponies made the crossing, hoisted in makeshift slings that swayed hundreds of feet above the roaring river below. Yimai belonged to one of the smaller indigenous groups. Within her family, they spoke a language they had never written down. Years earlier, missionaries had worked among a larger neighboring group, translating songs and scripture into that language instead. Yimai and her people learned it so they could read, sing, and worship alongside them. Beyond the valley, the national language was used for school, government, and dealings with the outside world. They crossed easily among all three languages, often switching mid-sentence, borrowing words when one fell short. When Yimei and I spoke, our conversations translated in the same way. We used a mix of languages without thinking about it. At home with TJ and others, it was no different. The official national language, indigenous languages, and English flowed through the house together. One person might say something in one language, and another would answer in a different one. The meaning still carried across. Over time, the conversation itself became its own living thing, imperfect but understood. When Yimei invited us to meet her family, she was openly proud. We drove for hours in the old four-wheel drive truck, climbing higher into the mountains as the road narrowed and trees brushed against the windows. Just before we arrived, her father called. Her mother had woken up that morning, unable to feel one side of her body, with speech broken and her face slack. Her father, already in his 70s, had carried her on his back and walked 6 hours to the nearest clinic, a single room staffed by one nurse, with limited supplies. Together, they believed it had been a stroke. There was no money for a hospital, and no straight way to reach one. When we arrived and saw how severe it was, I called a Dutch friend of mine, a nurse with more field experience than many doctors, and asked for guidance. Neither of us had money either, but we went ahead anyway, trusting we would somehow cover the cost and hoping her organization might later help with any remaining fees. We loaded the vehicle with her mother, sisters, aunties, cousins, and children, then tied sacks of vegetables and chickens to the roof. If we were heading to the city, the trip had to serve more than one purpose. The sisters planned to sell the produce and buy necessities before returning home. It was the rainy season, and the mountain roads had turned into rivers of red mud. We chained the tires and crept downward, slipping and grinding until the road finally leveled out. Chickens squawked, babies cried, and the vehicle felt full of urgency and purpose. At the hospital, doctors confirmed it had been a stroke. They checked for clots and bleeding and watched for further damage. Nothing more dangerous appeared, only exhaustion and the extensive work of recovery ahead. The day was draining, hours traveling, followed by long waiting in the dim hospital ward, hoping it was nothing worse, even though the stroke itself was enough. Before returning home, we traded produce for supplies, filling the truck with rice, cooking oil, salt, and necessities for remote village life. Back in the village, Yimei's mother and the other women settled in for the night while the men returned from hunting, with a strange catch. The meal was tender and smoky, unlike anything I had tasted before. When I asked what it was, we worked through a long list of animals without landing on an answer. Finally, Yimei's father led us outside and pointed to the pelt. It looked like a small deer with tusks. He smiled and pressed a finger to his lips. Some questions did not need answers. About 9 months later, TJ and I returned for another visit. Yimei's mother met us standing in the doorway. The woman who had once been piggybacked by her husband from the mountains now stood upright and smiling. She lifted her arms proudly, flexing her fingers to show their strength. Each morning, with no therapy and no medical guidance, she had forced her body to recover by climbing the steep mountain paths, dragging her weak leg until strength slowly returned. The mountains had become her rehabilitation. TJ ate anything placed in front of him and made sure I never had to suffer through novel meals alone. Yimei's mother adored him especially when he asked for seconds and thirds of her prized black-skinned chicken soup, which she prepared with obvious pride. TJ slipped easily into village life, becoming a sort of big brother to many of the people we worked alongside. Watching Yimei's mother traverse confidently through her home and along the mountain paths again, I understood something deeper about the place and the people who lived there. The mountains did not simply make people strong, they made them certain of one another. When hardship came, there were no long questions or complaints. They simply carried on carrying each other until life balanced again. We left that valley with more than memories. The mountains taught us patience, endurance, and the strength of people who bear one another through life. Those lessons followed us, where friendships slowly widened into something that looked and felt very much like family. Yimei lived with us for a season while she worked and studied. Around the same time, another young woman, Bai, joined our household. She came from another part of Asia, carrying her own calling, her own work, and her own uncertainty about where life would lead next. Neither arrangement was a long-term plan. It simply grew out of need, trust, and the understanding that sometimes people require a place to land while they figure out their path. Over time, our home filled up. Not crowded in a chaotic sense, but full in a welcoming way. Bai Yi and Yimei worked closely with students who often struggled with being far from their families for the first time. Many afternoons, TJ and I returned from markets or field visits to find several of those students sitting at our kitchen table, drinking tea, doing homework, or simply needing a place to exist without pressure. Another friend, Dongmei, arrived during a very unreasonable season of her life and stayed with us for several months. Like the others, she did not need answers or fixing. She needed space, safety, and time. Our home provided that without ever formally deciding to become that kind of place. It simply happened because we rarely said no when someone needed a roof, a meal, or a simple place to stop and be. Jedi settled into this environment as naturally as he did everywhere else. He walked between rooms, greeting each new arrival with calm acceptance, curling beside students while they studied, or resting at the feet of whoever seemed to need comfort most. His presence softened the edges of the space, especially for young people far from home. He never demanded attention, yet he always drew it, offering a grounding presence that made strangers feel welcome within minutes. One year, Yimei and Bai Yi asked if we would host a Thanksgiving dinner. Most of the students had only heard about the holiday through stories and movies. What they really wanted was an excuse to gather, share food, and feel connected to something larger than themselves. TJ and I agreed without understanding how large the evening would become. We cooked for days. Meat became the centerpiece, something many students rarely afforded. We wanted to make this a memorable event and a blessing for the students. Desserts followed, adjusted carefully, because traditional Western sweets were far too sugary for most of their tastes. By the time evening arrived, nearly 50 people filled our home. Every chair, step, and corner of the kitchen became occupied by laughter, conversation, and plates piled high with food. Late into the night, when our gathering finally slowed down, we realized that most of the buses had shut down. TJ and I loaded groups of students into our vehicle and drove each one home or to the university campus. No one ever discussed it as an obligation. It felt like the natural ending to a gathering that had care and responsibility as its foundation. Holidays often carried a different weight. During major cultural celebrations, many students could not afford the travel required to return home. Our house became a second gathering place during those times as well. Some slept on our floor, others stretched across couches or shared rooms. There were long conversations, shared meals, and the reassurance that no one needed to sit alone while the rest of the country celebrated family. Rabah and Jani were an ever-present part of our days. We visited their small jewelry shop, sat together over tea, and shared stories that ranged from the ordinary to the absurd. Sometimes they came to our house, bringing treats or just themselves, and fit in as naturally as anyone else. Their easy presence became one more thread of daily life alongside the students, the celebrations, and the constant comings and goings that made the house feel like a retreat. Yime's village had first shown me what it meant to carry one another through difficulty. Our home slowly became an extension of that same understanding. There were no announcements, no mission statements, and no plans to build anything formal. People simply arrived, stayed, healed, laughed, studied, and eventually went on into their own lives. Yime and Bai Yi both married kind men and built families of their own. Dongmei found her footing again and stepped back into life with confidence. Many of the students who once filled our kitchen continued into careers, marriages, and futures that honored us by allowing us to watch from a distance. None of it felt extraordinary while it was happening. It felt like daily life, shaped by open doors, shared meals, and the belief that family could grow without blood or paperwork. It formed through time, presence, and the willingness to let people stay until they were ready to leave. Hosting teams often presented accommodation challenges. Many rural towns offered no guest lodging that met even basic hygiene or safety standards. More than once, the only viable option was renting out the entire local brothel. These buildings often had the only reliable running water, air conditioning, and locking doors. To keep everything transparent and respectful, we paid the owners for the full week, including compensation for lost business. The visitors rarely complained. A clean bed and a functioning bathroom meant they could rest and return the next morning, ready to treat hundreds of patients. The first time we stayed in one, the humor was impossible to ignore. Every room contained mirrors on nearly every surface, walls behind the bed, and one large mirror mounted on the ceiling. Every single room. It became a running joke among the team and eased tension in a place none of us expected to stay. Food created its own challenges. In one town, there were no restaurants open during normal hours. We found a small open-air beer garden decorated with lanterns and wooden benches, and convinced the owner to cook for our team each evening after work. On the first night, the group relaxed for the first time all week, enjoying mild local dishes and cooler evening air. About 20 minutes into dinner, the entertainment for the night began rehearsing. A group of transgender performers stepped onto a small stage, music and lights starting without warning. The doctors froze mid-bite, caught between shock and politeness, while I tried not to laugh. Cultural surprises arrived in many forms, and that evening came wrapped in sequins and stage lights. Experiences like this were not unusual. In many border towns, brothels doubled as guest houses, and beer gardens doubled as cabaret spaces. Once, we unknowingly stayed in a guest house that operated as a brothel after dark. During the day, it appeared entirely respectable. We even rented bicycles from the front desk. That evening, after showering in a shared hallway bathroom, I was halfway dressed when someone knocked firmly on the door. A woman's voice demanded her clothes. After donning my own clothes, I eased the door open. She stood wearing little more than a thin bikini, pointing toward a shelf inside the bathroom. Without realizing it, I had taken over her changing space. Later, walking back to my room, I passed a hallway filled with businessmen carrying briefcases and women dressed in glitter and perfume. I slipped into our room. We locked the door and pushed the television against it before settling in for the night. Moments like these required quick adaptation, humor, and calm acceptance. They were part of navigating remote regions where infrastructure blurred between hospitality, entertainment, and survival. Beneath the humor, however, existed a harder truth that sat close to the surface. On the other side of the table, human exploitation remained a constant threat. It rarely appeared openly. It began with promises. Recruiters visited villages offering jobs, education, or a way out of subsistence farming. Families desperate for opportunity sometimes paid for travel arrangements, believing their children were stepping into a better future. Once they reached the city, they confiscated identification, inflated debts, and made escape nearly impossible. This problem did not affect only women and girls. People trafficked men into forced labor on fishing boats, construction projects, or pressed young boys into service as porters during guerrilla conflict. I met several who had trusted an offer that cost them their freedom. One village made the danger deeply personal. We became close to a family whose daughter attended university in a nearby city. Her father was proud and convinced she was thriving. Her mother carried concern. Rumors circulated about a karaoke bar that operated legitimately on the surface, but offered other opportunities behind closed doors. She feared her daughter might get drawn into something she could not leave. The mother asked if we could check on her daughter whenever we traveled through the city. It became a simple routine. We took the daughter to dinner, spent time with her and her friends, and made sure she felt supported and visible. She looked forward to those visits, talking freely about her classes and plans. After each visit, we reported it back to her mother, describing how she was doing and reassuring her that her daughter remained safe and focused on her studies. The seasons passed full and bright, each one marked by insignificant victories, laughter, and a shared purpose. Side by side, we navigated through work, village life, and tranquil evenings at home, carrying one another through whatever came our way. In those moments, life felt whole, and the world, for all its complexity, was exactly where we wanted to be.